Well, let's get more reaction and, of course, some analysis on that tariff announcement by the U.S. president. We are joined by Trade Collective Senior Research Fellow Dr. Lebohang Pheko, back on the show with us this evening. Also with us is the National Association of Automobile Manufacturers of South Africa's CEO, Michael Mabasa. We also are with the Transvaal Agricultural Union General Manager, Benny van Zyl, and COSATU Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, also back with us this evening. Taking your calls on 010-594-6010 and your WhatsApps, of course, on 072-110-5584. But thank you so much to our panel for joining us. The U.S. president yesterday, calling it Liberation Day, for the United States. And I mean, it was quite a show. Dr. Pheko, perhaps we start with you, right? Quite a show. He appears now with this board that has a list of countries, and then he announces what he says are kind reciprocal tariffs. Just the numbers really startling for me. 97%, he says, is what Cambodia is charging the U.S., and so they're reciprocating with 49%. We've been charging 60%, and the U.S. reciprocating tariffs to us with 30%. I want to start with this, Dr. Pheko. As you listened to what he had to say, number one, did the numbers make sense? And I don't know if you were at all surprised by the announcement.
Yeah, thanks, Naledi, and to the other panelists. So the numbers are a bit strange and a bit ad hoc. The few countries which are appearing on the list, which seem quite bizarre, a country like Bangladesh, for example, countries like Cape Verde, whereas a country such as Russia, which has quite a high trade deficit with the United States, doesn't appear at all. It's on the exemption list. A few other eccentric cases, of course, would be the Canada and Mexico, which previously have been acting and have been trading as a uni-bloc, essentially a borderless bloc as a result of the NAFTA and the many agreements that have superseded that between the Canada, the US, and Mexico. Problematic, and sometimes some feel very onerous, especially for a country like Mexico, which is by no means on par with the other two countries, and of course, it's sometimes viewed as quite exploitative, especially because of the cheap labor supply that comes from Mexico into the US, whilst of course being prohibited at borders. So it's a very eccentric, raft of measures. It also seems as well, this whole notion of reciprocity, we're aware that there's this 10% that's a baseline on all tariffs. And so for South Africa, as you rightly say, this has been reported as 30%. But one of the things that's the logic behind that is also the notion of protecting US markets. And I'm sure we'll go into that a bit later. But that's also a bit of a fallacy, because not only does this begin to push up the cost of production for the sending countries, it also pushes up the cost of for consumers, both within South Africa and other African countries, but also, in terms of terms intend to make things cheaper for Americans, it can only boost up the costs. And I think lastly to say, of course, the notion of trying to then impose this made in America, made in the US stamp, literally on all products, is again quite problematic, given that hardly anything is made in one place anymore, especially cars, especially the automobiles sector. So this is really I view this as quite an eccentric and slightly vindictive here and there, series of tariff bindings.
You talk about the U.S. president, Dr. Pheko, wanting to protect, the U.S. economy and be quite inward looking. And we will get into that a little bit later. But one standout moment is when he talked about how Apple is building a plant worth of $500 billion in the U.S. after they've been manufacturing outside of the country. I don't know if long term that is something that we're actually going to be seeing an investment that pays back. But we'll analyze that in a little bit. Let's get into some of the sectors, though. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Earlier on in the week, we were talking about a 25% automobile tariff for the sector, and now we're talking about 30%. So just give me clarity on what the numbers are going to look like for the automobile industry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naledi, and thank you for having us this evening. Well, look, I think the automotive industry is definitely disappointed to see the announcement by the US president, because effectively what this means is that for South Africa in particular, we will be obviously looking at a 55% tariff increase. If you look at both what was announced last week, which came into effect yesterday, or at least this morning, in South African time, and then certainly the announcement that looked at the 25% that was introduced and announced yesterday. Currently, obviously, South Africa is still a beneficiary of AGOA, which is obviously the free trade agreement that we have between South Africa and the United States and a few African countries, which is still in effect. We're obviously now trying to get clarity in relation to what is the status quo specifically of that particular trade agreement that we have with the US, and whether these announcements that have now been made are effectively rendering AGOA effectively not in force, because certainly that agreement was due to be renewed and hopefully expanded, because you'd recall that members of Congress were in South Africa last year, where we engaged with them quite very, very aggressively and very, very progressively in terms of not just renewing AGOA, but also expanding it, because there are a number of African countries who are currently not beneficiaries of the agreement, and we believe very strongly that those countries should obviously be considered for eligibility. So I think there's still a couple of unknowns, but certainly we are currently in conversations. And I think it also comes at a time when we are actually having next week, Tuesday, a council meeting of the International Organization for Motor Vehicle Manufacturers globally. And ironically, that council meeting is happening in Washington, D.C. And we are hoping, obviously, as South Africa, to position very, very firmly our position, and obviously to indicate very, very clearly our position in relation to how we see the impact of these tariff announcements that have been made by the president yesterday.
Yeah, we also have Benny van Zyl, and of course the agricultural industry going to be impacted quite a bit. And Benny, perhaps you can talk to us about with this announcement of a 30% tariff, where you see the red lights across the sector that are flashing for the industry.
Yeah, I think from our side, first of all, I want to say that you should realize that the country make decisions on his own behalf. But then, according the whole interaction between other countries, you will handle them separately the way we have relationships with them. And that is my concern, is that America makes some decisions now. President Trump from the beginning said America first. And I was concerned that this will happen before September, when we can discuss the AGOA agreement again, but now I think it's much earlier. But the way South Africa, and we should be quite honest about this, the way South Africa have these international relationships at this stage do not make America very happy. We actually have links with all America's enemies, and we do it openly. We took Israel to this international court. We have relations with Hamas, Iran, and those are the enemies of United States. So if you have an action from your side, you should realize there will be a reaction. So I think, first of all, I want to ask my government, please go and re-look your international relations. That is the starting point of why America give this huge penalty on us, and you give it throughout the world for the Britain, for example, 10%. But why 30% for us? Because he thinks something is wrong this side. So I think that's the starting point, that we have to go and re-look our own international relations. If we want to hit America every day in the face with our fist, and we ask with the right hand, we hit them with the left hand, we ask him, please help us. Doesn't work like that. What doesn't the government do? What do they not understand? For the agricultural sector, for sure, this is very intensive. It will have a huge impact on our exporters. And immediately it have an impact on South Africa, because there will be job losses, and we have such a high unemployment rate already. South Africa cannot afford it to do something wrong in the economy at this stage. We need to grow our economy, and this will be for sure have an impact on the negative side, profitability of a lot of our institutions, on the agricultural side for sure, but also on the other side, they can talk on their own behalf, they will have the impact by themselves as well. So at the end of the day, I think our economic growth will have a decline. I'm not so sure how big it will be, but that will not be for the benefit of South Africa. So we as citizens in South Africa are going to pay a price. And that is my concern. We have such big debt at this stage in our country. There's so many problems. And the only thing that can overcome these problems is to grow the economy.
Okay.
Why did we do all the wrong things? And that's for us the concern. So the whole process of this tariffs, for sure, it will have a heavy impact on us. And that's not for us something nice to have.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, though, Benny, is that last night as we brought to our viewers the US president announcing these tariffs, when he got to talking about South Africa, he certainly didn't say anything about our foreign policy. In fact, some of the words he used was, terrible things are happening over there and the news isn't looking into it. And that's about, you know, the bulk of what he said. But we will analyze the points that you've made as we get into the discussion. Matthew, could you assist us with what conversations actually look like with Washington, D.C.? I believe that you've also just come out of discussions with the Trump administration. What is the temperature like in those discussions? And I wonder how you feel when you've come back from those talks and then, you know, inverted commas, Liberation Day happens.
Thanks, Naledi. I mean, look, we've been as COSATU working closely with government, with the Department of Trade Industry, the presidency, DIRCO, also our colleagues in organized business, including agriculture, on our relationship with the US for the past few years. I think even under the Biden administration, there was difficulties on a geopolitical front, I think also on a trade front and so on. I think it's gotten a bit more of a different flavor under the new administration. But look, the tariffs that have been applied right now or been announced today, it's across the world, it's all countries. It's not because of the irritation or the non-irritation with us. It applies to Lesotho at a much higher rate. It applies to Madagascar, to Cambodia, to Britain, to Canada, to Australia, etc. So it's basically part of President Trump's economic manifesto that he was elected upon, about America first, about bringing jobs, bringing investment, bringing companies into the US. I think there's a philosophy of bringing even US companies back to the US. I think it's based on the domestic economic manifesto, but it's going to be a very painful blow if it's implemented. I don't think any car manufacturer can compete with, as Michael has said, you know, 30 plus 25%, a 55% tariff hike. How would you compete? I don't think our citrus farmers in the Western Cape can compete with a 30% tariff hike. Our clothing factories in Cape Town will struggle. So I think it's going to be a very painful blow, one we can't afford when we have a 1% economic growth rate for the past decade, or when we have a 41% unemployment rate. We can't afford this kind of a blow. Fortunately, it's all other countries also included in this discussion. So I think that gives a bit of a solidarity number, so to speak. But I think it's going to be a very difficult thing. We had gone to the US last week. We meant to have gone in February as, you know, organized labor, business, colleagues in government, to try to see what is the appetite for resetting the relationship between colleagues in the US, in government, in Congress, business, labor. What is the conditions they want, and so on. We were actually quite pleasantly surprised. I think across the board, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, whether it's in the administration or Congress or the White House, they want to reset a relationship with South Africa. They view us as an important partner. Yes, they are irritated with us on a variety of political issues, international relations issues, domestic issues. That's fine. It's not the first time we've had differences. They've given us a bit of a sense of how what would a reset entail. I think they recognize some of our own domestic limitations of what we can do. And also we recognize what they also have limitations. I think there's a desire to have a reset discussions quite quickly at the highest level of government. So that's quite positive. The noise is at times frustrating. I'm sure for them also our noise also might be frustrating to them. We're very different countries, very different histories, but I think fundamentally we need a strong relationship. This is the largest economy. It's our second largest trading partner. We need to have a good relationship with the US, just like we need to have a good relationship with China, with Brazil, with the Europeans, with India, with Africa, and so on. But I think the task right now is to see how do we manage an alternative to a 30% tariff hike, because that is going to be a devastating blow. I don't know how Benny's various agricultural organizations would cope with that. They won't be able to cope with that. And that we have 1 million jobs plus in the farming sector. We can't afford to see it bleed. Similarly, we've got over 300,000 jobs in the motor manufacturing sector. I don't know how would a Ford or BMW or Mercedes compete with that. It's going to be very difficult. And I can imagine right now, if I was a farmer, I'll be frantically phoning people in Europe or China to see, do you want to buy some grapes, some pecans, and so on. But that's a difficult thing because you can't shift these things so quickly.
Yeah.
But I think also, to be honest, it's also going to hurt consumers in the US. You're going to see inflation spiking. You're going to see goods becoming very expensive that they don't produce. We've also seen concerns from our colleagues in the trade union movement in the US who fear that they can lose jobs as a consequence. So we hope that there's space for discussion. We hope there's a space for a better alternative, which will benefit both sides of the discussion. But right now, it doesn't look good at all, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm keen to get into on the other side of this short break is, are we at a point where we're able to think long-term about what happens even post-Trump administration? One of the points that was raised by former President Thabo Mbeki this week while paying tribute to Aziz Pahad was around South Africa needing to plan for a post-Trump administration and, of course, the short-term pain that we might see. We'll analyse some of that on the other side of this. Stay with us. Welcome back. We continue to get reaction to the announcement by US President yesterday of a 30% tariff on South African imports. And we're taking calls as well on 010-594-6010 and WhatsApps on 072-110-5584. Always keen to hear from you. Solly is calling in from Hammanskraal. Solly, good evening.
Yes. Good evening, ma'am.
Yes, thanks for calling.
Yes.
Go ahead, sir.
My point I want to raise is I'm not so clear with my English because I'm an old man.
That's okay.
But let's leave Donald Trump with USA, and we must focus with South Africa and Africa as a whole and European countries whom they used to support us. And then we'll survive rather than bullying with men with everything. Let's go with Africa and European countries, and then we'll be much better like that. I don't think maybe I'm doing wrong or what, because Donald Trump is not our God. Our God in South Africa is Barnabas the Kenyan.
Thank you so much for calling. And that is only there in Hammanskraal saying, let's look inward as well as South Africans. Dr. Peko, I want to come back to you. There's so much to talk about in so little time, unfortunately. So I'm going to try and squeeze in as many thoughts as I possibly can with you, if you'll allow me. I mean, there's the issue of the sort of long-term outlook here, right? And I mentioned before the break there what former President Thabo Mbeki's talked about around, well, we might see short-term pain, and then after the Trump administration, things, resetting, if you will. And I don't know what you make of that. The US president also announcing big corporates that are taking investment out of various countries across the world and bringing them into the US. I mean, the sustainability of that as well. And then Ntatisoli says, leave the US to it's Trump, but let's look inward.
Yeah, leave the US with the US and leave us with our South Africa. I mean, if we look at the sorts of exports and our largest exports are to China, the US, Germany, Mozambique, and the United Kingdom. And our largest imports are almost, commensurate to that, but also including India, the US, United Arab Emirates, and Germany again. And I think that there is something to be said about rethinking and reframing with some urgency a lot of our other existing economic structures. I mean, the SACU, for example, has been, to all intents and purposes, absolutely moribund for the last couple of decades. It is really it exists as a legal entity, but really has not got much dynamism. Is this the moment perhaps to rethink and to reframe much more useful economic relations, especially given that these countries have historic and quite deep relationships? The other is really to put our attention again, one more time with feeling to the SADC in a similar vein, the African Union, the ACFTA, the BRICS as alternative potential conduits for our economic interests and for shared mutual economic interests as well. I mean, the AGOA, which hasn't quite come up yet in conversation, but that's again sort of, I think about 32, 33, colleagues can correct me, countries which it seems also a randomized set of countries which have been selected. And of course, always at the US, the discretion of the US. Some have been suspended from time to time, at times when they were deemed to be not human rights friendly and so on. And, even the criteria for being the recipient of AGOA is to do with market-led economics, the rule of law, the protection of intellectual property and so on. I think after the sites of January 6th, a couple of years ago, the idea of the US preaching about the rule of law seems quite preposterous, to say the very least, as a condition on any other country. But I do think that it's an opportunity for us to rethink and to expand our opportunities elsewhere. Whilst I'm in agreement, for example, that, of course, as Matthew has said, that it's important to maintain economic and, to do the diplomatic work. This should not certainly be, this should not negate our ability to pursue other interests with, with countries with whom we have collegial relationships, respectful relationships, and also relationships of mutuality. I think also to the point that was made a bit earlier around the idea that perhaps we have overstepped our international relations mandate. This is not this. We have always had an interesting and sometimes quite combative relationship with the US. This goes back to the 1970s when we were called terrorists and all of this. This is not necessarily new. I do think that I'd like us to evoke, of course, what one of our first presidents said, which was that, your enemies are not our enemies, and that in the context of sovereignty, and that all sovereignties are equal, we should not be dissuaded, and we should not be dissuaded from our autonomy and our right to pursue sovereignty and make South Africa great again and make Africa great again as well.
Yeah, I do remember that was the former President Nelson Mandela who said that. There's quite a few blurred lines as well when you start to look at, from a sectoral point of view, what the impact of these tariffs might be. And Michael, perhaps help us out with these blurred lines. So you do have, for instance, Ford, an American automobile company that manufactures here in South Africa. What happens with what happens with that trade there? And then this is quite interesting. I mean, Times Live, for instance, reporting today that Ford has, of course, announced a broad discounts as tariffs drive sales surge. You've got this, buyers are rushing to the dealer lots to snap up cars before price increases. So, sweet and sour there. But yeah, the Ford question is an interesting one, isn't it? I think your mic is off, Michael.
Yeah, sorry about that. It is absolutely interesting. I think the Ford case study is definitely very interesting for one reason, Naledi, because I think the automotive industry is evolving into the production of new energy vehicles. We now know for a fact that Ford Motor Company that is based in Silverton in Tshwane is going to produce the only Ford Ranger buggy in the world, which is the Ranger plug-in hybrid. You will never, ever get that vehicle anywhere else in the world, which means effectively that Americans who seek to buy that particular vehicle can only source that vehicle from South Africa. Previously, the Ford Ranger that was produced in the same plant, you could also get it in the United States. You could also get it from Thailand. So we used to have 3 plants that were producing the same vehicle for the world. Currently, different automakers are now recalibrating their manufacturing processes. Similarly, the BMW X3 that we are producing in Roslyn, in Tshwane also, that vehicle will also be produced only in Roslyn, but definitely not anywhere else. So effectively what this means is that Americans who are seeking to buy their own brand that are produced in South Africa will obviously be paying a lot more. And we've seen this morning, in fact, as soon as the president announced the tariffs yesterday, a number of European automakers have already announced that they will not be in a position to absorb these particular tariffs. they will be passing on, unfortunately, these increases onto the US consumers. And I think Matthew has made that point very, very eloquently, because that's what is actually likely to happen, where Americans are now going to be paying top dollar for the vehicles that they're going to be getting from many, many other markets around the world, because we've got a number of markets that are now producing vehicles, and all of them are impacted directly, because when you look at the list that President Trump announced, none of the vehicle manufacturing countries were spared, in fact, and all of them in one shape or form, including the United Kingdom, have been subjected to some form of tariff increases as well, including some of the close allies of the US.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating case, isn't it? And I want to bring Benny back in here. And I know, Benny, it's quite difficult to have this conversation and not bring in the politics. And of course, we welcome the perspective. But for the sake of our viewer, I think a lot of people are wondering what the impact on this is going to be on their own food trolley, right? And I don't know if we're able to simplify it to that extent. Well, we do have a 30% tariff increase. What does it mean for the South African and their food basket? Some of the big concerns and perhaps even opportunities that you see, Dr. Peko, talking about how we do need to start looking at other relations where we are able to maximize on those opportunities with other countries. Opportunities and the impact for South Africans, if you will.
Yeah, Naledi, individual, there will be some impact, but holistic, there will also be some impact, and it will play out by time. The economic principles have this ability to bring things back to a type of balance, but it takes time. In South Africa, and we talk now about this tariffs exporting to the United States, that will cost our farmers a lot of extra money, and they will not be competitive in the United States. For an example, at this stage, I know that the United States citrus industry is not in a very good shape, and they import quite a lot of that. But if they, for an example, ask us a 30% tariff and they ask another country 10%, then the price factor will be something that we will not compete with. So for the income of the South African farmer, those that export, that will have an impact, and that will have, for sure, some problems in the job creation part of his industry as well. For the consumers in South Africa, I think on the short term, things will stay at, not with ups and downs, it can stay the same. The only problem is a lot of people are going to lose their job. They don't have money to buy food. And it's not so easy to create a new market. There's a lot of infrastructure. The cold chain should be kept in place. And you have the transport systems that working now. And now you have to create something else to another place. And that market is perhaps already full of that produce that you want to take there. So it's not so easy to just enter a market and think you will sell your produce. You have to build it up. It goes about trust, the relations, market agents have to do this over time. So it's not as if you can just switch over to something else and then everything will be fine. So from my side, I hope that we will, by means of bilateral interaction with the Americans, but also other markets, we should expose ourselves to much more markets in the world. But we shouldn't throw away the United States. We should interact with them and see what can we manage to get some solution one way or another. And this is not fixed in steel. It's changeable. You can next year or in a month or two, you can say, but this commodity will be 10%. Another one can be nothing. Another one can be 62%. Because at this stage, if we talk about what we ask the United States, it's 62% for their poultry if they want to bring it in, but it's not for everything. I haven't got all the figures in hand. So we shouldn't generalize and say, yes, it's 60%. It's 62% for poultry, but not necessarily for all the rest. So, but I think our government should make some adjustments. We have to be honest about that. We cannot say to the world, we are neutral, but we don't play the neutral game. So they have to play the interaction with, specifically now, the United States on a more neutral and positive manner. They have to reach out and they have to try and go and see what can they manage to overcome this problem that exists at this stage and to keep that market intact if possible. But in the meantime, we have to create other markets as well.
All right. Well, we're going to take a short break and we'll wrap up the conversation on the other side of this and take a look at some of the WhatsApps that have come in from our viewers. That number, 072-110-5584. Stay with us. Welcome back. We continue to get reaction to U.S. President Donald Trump yesterday announcing a 30% tariff for South African imports. But of course, South Africa, not the only country that has been impacted. In fact, the U.S. President yesterday presenting a list of countries that will be getting those tariffs that he says are reciprocal. And there he was yesterday with that list, an incredibly long list with fascinating lists of countries on there. And perhaps a little bit later, we'll take a look at some of the numbers that he shared. But essentially, the U.S. President announcing that that they are now going to impose what he calls kind reciprocal tariffs that are 50% of what countries are charging the U.S. Let's see the WhatsApps that have come in from our viewers on this one. The views from those that have come in this evening. Gudrun is saying the government should focus on building economic resilience by promoting export-led growth, encouraging private investment and developing a more robust economy. Gudrun, thank you so much for that. Asking for resilience in South Africa. Koti says President Trump is telling us that go take the money you used to pay lawyers for the International Court of Justice on behalf of Palestine. Okay, Koti, thanks for that. Another one that says, good evening, my name is Herman Leshiba from Limpopo, Njelele. My position is that South Africa should respond harshly since America is not the only country to trade with. All USA companies trading in South Africa should also pay more tax so that they can put more pressure on the Trump administration. All right, thank you so much for that. We'll take more on 072-110-5584. Matthew, perhaps I come to you for what I really, I think it's final thoughts, and we'll go around the room for this. But again, the U.S. president presenting a list of countries. I mean, what do you foresee is going to be the reaction from the various countries and the impact of that?
Look, I think maybe that's the one positive kind of lining in the clouds, very dark clouds right now, is that this is not a South African issue, it's a global issue. I think if we were by ourselves alone, that'll be very difficult because we're, a smallish country. And of course, we've got turbulent geopolitical issues to deal with. But the fact that it's the entire world, from Australia to China, it gives a little bit of comfort in numbers that there can be a global discussion on what's a fair compromise with the US. We understand, as a trading federation, what the issues that Trump is raising. We have the same issues of deindustrialization, of job losses, of jobs being shipped overseas, and so forth, of ghost towns. We understand that issue. But I think if there's a way to do these things in a win-win way, we think, if we have a reset relationship with the US, address our geopolitical issues, find each other where we have differences, manage our differences. But we think there's opportunities on a trade front and investment front that could be beneficial. We have South African companies who invest in the US. Perhaps there's a way for them to do more business in the US. We want to see more US companies, and there's over 600 here, coming to South Africa. We think there's ways to address any concerns they have around pork, for example, or poultry and so forth, and our concerns too around those same issues. We can address it. There's a bit of a misconception that the 60% South African tariffs on the US imports is not factually true. It looks at our tariffs that we charge, which is about 7.4% on average. It looks at our VAT, which is unfair because the US also has their own equivalent to a VAT. Yeah. But the bigger amount actually is about the trade deficit. And that speaks because of the US wants our exports, our mineral exports, which are strategic minerals, which they are needed for US factories, which have actually quietly been exempted from this. So we need to have a calm, sober discussion to say how to address the US's domestic concerns. How does the US address our domestic concerns? How can we find each in the middle? What we can't afford, Naledi, is a trade war, because you might find that China, Japan, Korea, the European Union, etc., major economies will apply with their own tariffs, and that's going to plunge the world into a lot of instability. And the developing world, including ourselves, we can't afford that. We've got so many issues to deal with. We can't afford to be adding to these issues. And industries like agriculture are very sensitive. They've got many issues already, from crop disease to drought, etc. Motor manufacturing is also a very complicated thing. You can't just shift trading partners overnight. So I think for us, we really want to have sober discussions urgently and find a common sense win-win solution going forward.
Yeah, you talk about that exemption, and I think that is quite important to note, right? So you do have key metal exports, platinum, gold, manganese exempted from that 30% tariff. That is something, isn't it? Dr. Pheko, I'm just looking at just some of the list here, you know, and maybe I'll read just some of it. China, the European Union, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, India, South Korea, Thailand, Switzerland, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. And I'm not even halfway through the list of what the US president showed us last night. What do you think the impact of this is going to be when you see these countries respond? I think that's going to be, you know, if we step out and we go, okay, from a bird's eye view, how these countries respond, and then, you know, what that means a year later, what we might see.
Look, I mean, countries like Vietnam have used tariff adjustments, and they've used WTO actions in the past. They did that when the US initially launched some tariff changes in the early 2010s, if I'm not mistaken, and they reduced their own duties on certain US exports so that they could remain competitive. And then they raised those tariffs on specific products, especially in the agricultural sector, to protect their own domestic industries. And I think that's to Benny's point earlier, that there is some elasticity to that. These tariffs they're not necessarily, they're not set in concrete. We too have the levity to, of course, increase and reduce them. Obviously, not in a way that right now would appear combative, but I do think that we have some levity and some leeway in that regard. China, as we know, is incredibly litigious, and they use the WTO dispute settlement mechanism quite vociferously. They've done this as well on their own stuff like solar panels, aluminium products. They've filed complaints in the past on the WTO as well against the US, and they've seen these as protectionist and as punitive. And India as well, who's also another partner of ours through the BRICS, have also made retaliatory measures in the cotton sector. So again in the early 2000s, and again using the WTO. And of course, the WTO it's not per se it's got its own neoliberal deficiencies, but certainly at a time such as this, it does appear that it has been an anchor for the way that trade is being done, and it's been completely circumvented. And perhaps this is something that we can begin to try to engage with constructively as well. And again, to go back to the SACU, which also has its own revenue sharing mechanisms built into the SACU, can we begin to resuscitate some of the relationships and the formations that have been historically useful for us, and as I say, much more respectfully, mutually.
Yeah, certainly an interesting time to be watching global politics and global economics. But just as we wrap up, from a sectoral point of view, the automotive sector, what does the sector need in the years that come? I mean, there's been the sort of view that the sector is going to start asking for some cushioning from government. What is needed for the sector at the moment, Michael?
Well, look, I think we need to take advantage of the fact that South Africa is hosting the G20 this year, and also B20 conversations. I think we need to take that advantage and bring all these nations into South Africa so that we can be able to really have a conversation around some of the issues that United States has already brought onto the table. I think from a sectoral point of view, we are quite comfortable that this is not a local, industry. It's a global industry. What happens in South Africa impacts other markets around the world. South Africa is obviously a manufacturing base, and we are an export-led, sector. 66% of the vehicles that we're currently producing in this country goes out to 148 different markets around the world. So we cannot afford, to have unilateral conversations with ourselves. We certainly need to leverage on the fact that the world is coming to Johannesburg, and how do we use that leverage to be able to bring the world together to be able to have these conversations.
Absolutely. 2025, quite the year, isn't it? Benny, final thoughts from you, and I'm going to ask the same one. What is it that the agricultural sector needs to be cushioned?
Yeah, from our side, we hope that our government can manage to get better relations, and they can actually stabilize this whole situation for us. We should realize in the world economic sphere, we are only a very small portion of that. And it's not as if we can, the tail can swing the dog. We should realize that. And therefore, we need another approach if we play the international game, and we have to play in. We have to make sure that we expand as much as possible. So from our side, let's stay positive. Let's hope that something occurs out of this. But we have to make our contribution and let's be the best producers. If our produce are the best in the world, the other countries would like to have that from our side.
Yeah. Well, and thank you so much to our panel this evening. It certainly has been an enlightening and fascinating discussion. Matthew Parks, COSATU Parliamentary Coordinator, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow with the Trade Collective, Michael Mabasa, who is a transport economist and CEO of the Automobile Manufacturers of South Africa, as well as Benny Fanzale. They're speaking to us from TLUSA. We take a short break. More news on the other side of this.